Stabbing the Homeless, the Skid Row Stabber. Welcome back to Ontario Cold Cases, Canada's true crime podcast, Historical True Crime Tuesdays, where we dive deep into some of the most notorious, mysterious, and shocking true crime stories. I'm your host, Jay Nickel of Nickel Investigations. 11 men were murdered in 11 separate crimes in the same part of a city under virtually identical circumstances. In most communities, it would be front page news for months. Yet because these victims were all homeless people, few have heard of these crimes, and in the beginning, media coverage was sparse. Only when the body count reached double digits did the media start paying attention. Skid Row is a 54 square blocks area in Los Angeles, California. Today is mostly populated by homeless people. Skid Row was formed at the turn of the century by migrant workers and transients who traveled west. In the 1970s, this part of Los Angeles became a refuge for alcoholics, drug users, and individuals suffering from mental illness. As you might have guessed, Skid Row is not the safest place in Los Angeles. Murderers like the Skid Row Slasher and the Skid Row Stabber preyed in this vulnerable population. Keeping track of the people who lived on Skid Row was nearly impossible, but it is estimated the population fluctuated between 6,000 to 10,000 people. The murders. The first murder committed by the Skid Row Stabber occurred in the early morning hours of October 23, 1978. Jesse Martinez, a 50-year-old cook, was discovered stabbed to death in a parking lot. His body was quickly found the next morning. The killer didn't bother trying to conceal his crime by hiding the body. Martinez was stabbed numerous times in his chest and his stomach. He wasn't homeless, but he worked at an establishment on Skid Row. His murder wasn't covered in the larger newspapers because of this. 6 days later, the killer struck again. Jose Cortez, a 32-year-old homeless man, was stabbed at approximately 1 o'clock a.m. in an alleyway. Once again, the killer didn't do anything to hide the crime. Chillingly, there was a message left on Cortez's body. Someone, presumably the murderer, wrote the word Satan on a piece of cardboard and placed it on Cortez. Small newspapers finally started to take notice, did a few write-ups about the murders. It had been a couple years since the Skid Row Slasher was active, and the media quickly gave a similar nickname to the new serial killer, Skid Row Stabber. The murders continued, and on October 30th, 1978, another lifeless body was found in an alleyway on Skid Row. The man was identified as Bruce Drake, a 46-year-old homeless man who lived in the area. J.P. Henderson, a 65-year-old transient, was discovered on November 4th, 1978. His body was on a sidewalk close to Skid Row, just a few blocks from where Bruce Drake was discovered 1 week earlier. The killer reveals himself. On November 9th, 1978, the investigation finally had an eyewitness. 3 homeless men were sitting in front of the Los Angeles Central Public Library. An African-American man approached them silently. He stared at the group of men. They weren't scared of him, but the unknown man made them uneasy because of his stare. One of the men asked this individual who he was. The reply was cryptic and frightening. "I am Luther. I am the peacemaker. I kill winos." He then walked away. A few minutes passed before a scream echoed through the streets of Skid Row. 3 men ran toward the sound and discovered David Jones on the ground. He was a 39-year-old homeless man who often spent time with the trio who found him. He called the emergency services right away because arrived Jones described the man who had attacked him. His friends realized it was the man speaking to them a few minutes earlier. Once the police arrived at the scene, David Jones was propped against a wall, breathing heavily. He rolled up his shirt, showed the officers the wounds, and died. Friends described the man they talked to, saying he was an African American between 28 and 32 years old, tall and around 210 pounds. One of the witnesses mentioned he had a Spanish or Caribbean accent, but the rest disagreed. Nightly kills. The killings continued on November 11th when a security guard found Francisco Perez Rodriguez around 5:30 a.m. in a parking lot. He had multiple stab wounds in his upper torso. Rodriguez died about 2 hours before the guard discovered him. Police had a stakeout team nearby. They left about 20 minutes before the murder happened. Just 24 hours later, the police had 2 more victims. Frank Reed was a 36-year-old homeless man who sought shelter from the rain in the LA Mission. The mission was full that night, and Reed had to spend the night on the streets. His body was discovered at 11:30 p.m. Then just 15 minutes later, 49-year-old Agustin Luna was found dead around the corner. On November 17th, the unidentified killer murdered a 35-year-old Native American man, Jimmy White Buffalo. He spent an evening with his friends at a bar and was murdered in the adjacent parking lot. The next day, police questioned a man named Tracy Scott, who fit the description provided by the 3 eyewitnesses. However, they released Scott shortly after due to the lack of evidence. 6 days later, on November 23, 1978, 45-year-old Frank Garcia was sitting on a bench across from the city hall smoking a cigarette. It's close to the police headquarters. It didn't stop the killer from murdering Garcia and leaving him there. While the victim's profile didn't match because Garcia was a janitor who was stabbed multiple times, it is believed that the killer took Garcia's lighter, probably as a trophy. Police found a bloody handprint near the body. The detectives had the first piece of physical evidence. Now the killings were being covered in the Los Angeles Times. The survivors. There were 3 attempted murders, and the survivors provided their descriptions of the attacker. John Wesley Porter was the first suspect, but he was ruled out. Then the investigators questioned Gary Lee Stinson for weeks. He was released on December 11th. The police spotted strange graffiti in a bathroom inside the Greyhound bus station in Los Angeles. It said, "My name is Luther. I kill winos. I put them out of misery." It made the police think that the killer left Los Angeles on a bus. Their theory was possible since there weren't any murders in the month of December. But on January 21st, 1979, the killer struck again. Luis Alvarez, a 26-year-old, was discovered in an alleyway near 415 Harlem Place, just outside Skid Row. Alvarez was younger than the previous victims and wasn't homeless, but the rest fit the killer's MO. Alvarez was the last confirmed victim of the Skid Row stabber. Bobby Joe Maxwell. In April 1979, the investigators arrested Bobby Joe Maxwell, 29-year-old Skid Row regular. He was born in January 1950 in Columbia, Tennessee. Maxwell grew up in a large family and was described as a good person by his younger siblings. He ended up in prison for an armed robbery and then moved to Los Angeles in 1977, hoping to become a karate instructor. His dreams didn't come true. Maxwell became homeless. 2 of his sisters lived in Los Angeles, so he would occasionally sleep at their apartments. But he spent most of his time on Skid Row. They made him a suspect because of the belief that the killer was in jail in December 1978 when the killing stopped. Maxwell was arrested on December 14th after being caught standing over a homeless man. While this isn't an offense, Maxwell also had a knife in his pocket. He was released on January 18, 1979, just 3 days before the final victim was stabbed. While Maxwell was behind bars, the Skid Row stabber didn't attack anyone. Police started trailing him, and on April 4th, 1979, they noticed he was walking by all the Skid Row stabber's crime scenes. He then went into a movie theater, and the police arrested him there. Maxwell was renting a room, and the investigators went through his belongings. There they found long knives and books about Satanism. The police suspected the murders might be linked to the occult because they suspected the name Luther was connected to Lucifer. A handwriting analysis revealed that Maxwell wrote the bus station graffiti. A preliminary trial was held in May 1979. Maxwell pleaded not guilty to 11 counts of murder. The court case was delayed for years, and one of the eyewitnesses passed away. But Maxwell appeared in front of a judge in 1984. The bloody handprint found by the City Hall matched Maxwell. It was the only evidence that connected him to the murders. The knives in the cult books were deemed circumstantial. Prosecution also presented the testimony of Sidney Storch, a jailhouse informant who shared a cell with Maxwell. According to Storch, Maxwell confessed to the murders. Bobby Joe Maxwell was sentenced to life without parole in July 1984 for the murder of Frank Garcia and David Jones. Serial liar. Maxwell filed an appeal right after the trial. In 1989, it was revealed that Sidney Storch wasn't a reliable source because he would often present false confessions to reduce his sentence. He'd done this multiple times already. An investigation unveiled that Storch read about the cases in newspapers and then made up the confessions. Additionally, he was teaching other inmates to do the same thing. In 1992, Storch was arrested for perjury but didn't get his day in court because he died soon after. Further controversies. Not everyone was convinced Maxwell was indeed the Skid Row stabber. Evidence found in his home that suggested he had something to do with the killings was purely circumstantial. For instance, Frank Garcia's lighter was missing after his body was found. Investigators suspected the killer had taken it. Maxwell owned a Bic lighter was similar to the one Garcia had. Garcia's wife confirmed it was her husband's lighter, but couldn't pick it out when presented with more similar Bic lighters. The bloody handprint, which was the main piece of evidence, was also debunked. Forensics couldn't determine the exact age of the handprint, meaning it could have been left there days before the murder. Maxwell's conviction was overturned in 2010 after 30 years. He was granted a retrial. While he waited for the new trial, Maxwell suffered a heart attack in December 2017, fell into a coma. All the charges against him were dropped in August 2018, and Maxwell was found not guilty. Unfortunately, Maxwell never regained consciousness. He passed away on April 28, 2019, age 69, but because of the coma, he never experienced freedom. The identity of the Skid Row stabber remains unknown to this day. Thank you for listening, and if you enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe to Ontario Cold Cases, Canada's true crime podcast. Available wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. And leave us a review. Follow us on social media for updates and behind-the-scenes content.